The following program is a UW-TV classic.
From the University of Washington in Seattle, Upon Reflection.
Hello and welcome to Upon Reflection. I'm Marcia Alvar. It's been said that we all live with three kinds of lies: the lies we tell others, the lies we tell ourselves, and the lies we don't even know we're telling, or more importantly, living. Self-deception and estrangement are central themes in the novels of Kazuo Ishiguro, one of Great Britain's most acclaimed young writers. Ishiguro's first two books were set in Japan, the country where he was born, but left while still a child. His third and best-known work, The Remains of the Day, was made into a film. Ishiguro's newest and much anticipated novel is The Unconsoled. Welcome to Upon Reflection.
Hi.
I wanted to start with a couple of assumptions, assuming that in this country anyway, The Remains of the Day is your best-known work, and assuming as well that people have certain expectations of upcoming work based on the work that they know. How great a surprise will The Unconsoled come to those readers?
Well, from what I've been reading, I mean, it's going to be quite a big surprise. I think I read the thing in the New York Times yesterday that suggested perhaps it was constructed specifically to confound people who'd like The Remains of the Day. It wasn't that deliberate, but I suppose looking at it from a certain distance, yes, it might be a surprise for various reasons. I mean, it's a lot longer. It's a very different sort of book. It may be more challenging, particularly for some of the readers. But I have a lot of faith in readers. I think there are a lot of people out there who don't mind being a little challenged.
I'm interested that you said it wasn't that deliberate, because I think the way you described The Remains of the Day was that it was very controlled. It was almost like a piece of music, very orchestrated, and that you wanted this book to be something more jagged and more rough.
Yeah, my writing a different sort of book was perhaps quite deliberate, but what I was saying was that I wasn't that aware of other people's expectations or how the world out there might perceive the change in me. I mean, I was going in a certain direction anyway. I mean, by the time I was promoting The Remains of the Day, I had all kinds of ideas about the next book and so on. So I was off in this little world anyway. I think this is kind of what happens. Writers don't tend to live in a very public world, like actors or kind of musicians, performers. Yeah, and so a lot of the time I'm kind of working in this slightly shabby kind of very private world where it's just me and these bits of paper. And then every now and again I'm thrust out there, and then people say, "God, this is a surprise. It's very different to what we were expecting," and that comes as a bit of a shock to me. But in the course of my working life, I don't have such a heightened sense of what is or isn't expected of me. I'm obliged to follow something kind of inside myself. I wanted to write a particular kind of book one day, and then I wanted to try this, and I because as a writer, I kind of live in a fairly solitary world of creation.
One of the things I've read that you said was that for each of your novels, you wanted them to represent, in some sense, a step forward for yourself as a writer and as an artist. And I wondered if you would take the 4 books you've written and revisit what the step forward was for yourself in each of them, starting with the first book you wrote, A Pale View of Hills.
Well, this is an interesting exercise. It's like,
Did you really succeed?
Yeah, well, it's quite intimidating. You have to kind of figure out whether you've really been progressing or not. So, well, I would say, actually, what happens when you write a novel is that you discover what things you were only superficially interested in and what things you were deeply interested in. Because during the course of writing the book, your kind of interest in certain themes just gets used up. And then you're, at the end of it, you're left with certain areas that you think, well, this still remains unfathomed. You have to go back and do it more thoroughly. And in my first novel, a lot of things I thought were themes I was interested in, kind of in this sense, got satisfied, just in the process of writing about it. But
and what were the themes? Those first ones.
Well, the first novel concerns a lot of things like exile and parental responsibility.
It's about the main character is a woman, Etsuko.
Yeah.
Middle-aged Japanese woman living in England.
Yeah, and a lot of it is memories of Nagasaki immediately after the war. But then I discovered something that I became very interested in my subsequent books, the idea that somebody could... I became interested in what was actually the subplot in my first novel. I became very interested in this idea that somebody could give their best efforts out of idealistic intentions to a cause, only to find that towards the end of his life, the society has completely changed its values, and that he's obliged to actually accept that all his efforts were not only in vain, but he had actually contributed something bad. And of course, if you look at Japan before and after the war, you see a lot of just ordinary people who did this. I'm not talking about the war criminals or people who did hideous things. I'm talking about just ordinary people who, because they didn't have a remarkable perception about the values of their time, they just wanted with their jobs to do what they thought was the right thing. So here we talk. I became interested in these teachers, and later on a kind of a painter, who somehow their careers got caught up with the nationalism, the militarism.
And ended up being Masuji Ono, the character in the second book.
Yeah.
An artist of the floating world, more of a propagandist than an artist. And there's a lot of self-deception about his work.
Well, that was his misfortune, that he was an artist at the time of militarism. And so he took the path towards propaganda, actually believing that this was what art should be. And so I became very interested in these people whose lives became flawed simply because they didn't quite see how the larger world, the larger political world, impinged on their small professional and private world. And but well, you're asking me to sort of chart, how I moved on. When I finished that second novel, I thought I had covered pretty precisely the professional side of the question, how can you waste your life? But it seemed to me that this wasn't enough. You can waste your life in other ways, in a fairly profound way.
Many different ways.
And it seemed to me that I had to discuss, how you could waste your life at that kind of human level, because you couldn't open yourself up to the emotions, because you couldn't commit yourself emotionally to other human beings. And so, in The Remains of the Day, I tried to explore both of these things at once. So that was about a butler who, yes, indeed, finds his professional side deeply morally compromised because his master happened to be a Nazi sympathizer, and he didn't care to examine how his particular contribution was being used by his master.
Why did you feel the first two novels should be set in Japan?
I think that was a lot to do with, yes, it was, there's a conscious part and an unconscious part, like in a lot of writers. The conscious part was, yes, I needed a setting where the social values had done a real topsy-turvy on a particular individual. So the very things he thought he was being told most of his life were good values suddenly become reviled values. So I needed that situation to examine what happens to an individual and his self-respect when that happens to him. Of course, I could have taken other situations, say Germany before and after the war. Now, I suppose I have the option of taking the old Soviet Union before and after the collapse of communism. A lot of people would have led their lives according to one set of values and now deeply regret that they did so. But of course I had a personal link with Japan, and I think the unconscious thing was that I very much needed to put down on paper my own precious kind of imagined Japan, a Japan put together throughout my childhood out of memory and speculation, And I think I realized that Japan only existed in my head when I reached my mid-20s, that it was a Japan that I couldn't actually visit by getting on an airplane. And also this personal, private Japan of mine was actually getting fainter and fainter as I got older, and it would fade away unless I preserved it in some kind of way. And I think that might have been a lot of the compulsion that led me to actually write a novel in the first place.
The voices of your novels are very different, the people who speak in your books. Tell me how Ryder came to be created, the concert pianist who seems to be on a kind of book tour from hell, to make a parallel with authors, a very mysterious concert tour where he doesn't seem to know why he's there, what he's doing, and neither does anyone around him necessarily.
Well, what you've got to understand about Ryder, the concert pianist, and indeed the whole of this book, is that yes, it is intended to have a metaphorical dimension. Book tours are not this bad, and I wouldn't for one moment imagine that book tours are of sufficient fascination to most people to warrant writing about for 500 pages. There are superficial resemblances between what happens to an author on a book tour and what happens to a concert pianist, I guess, when he's traveling around, but they're just superficial resemblances. I've tried to compress, I suppose, somebody's life into a kind of a metaphorical few days, and this is partly why everything is so weird. I'm trying to talk about going through life without a schedule, but not knowing what your schedule is in life, but being too embarrassed to admit it. And so this is kind of what's happened to him. He's arrived. He's here. He's in this town for a few days. He should be given a little piece of paper that tells him, what his next appointment is and what dinners he has to attend. All he knows is that he's got a very busy schedule, and at the end of it, he's got a very important concert. It's more than a concert, it's something very, very important on which everything hangs. And yet he hasn't got a clue, what his next appointment is. And indeed, this big event at the end is getting closer and closer, but he doesn't quite know what he's supposed to do when he gets up there. He knows that he's supposed to somehow deliver something to the community, and everybody's looking for it.
There's all these committee meetings that they want him to attend.
Yeah, and all these things. Yes, I'm trying to talk. I was trying to express a certain feeling about that. Life is very busy. It keeps tapping you on the shoulder and saying, "Could you please do this? Could you please do that?" I mean, and they're all requests that seem to be very important and urgent in themselves. You've got to worry about the laundry. You've got to worry about the cooking. You've got to worry about your children. And yet you kind of feel that there's something you should be getting on with, and you kind of left it unattended. And I've become very interested in this metaphor, this idea of this performance that's coming up in all our lives, that at some point, we're going to be pushed up onto some stage, metaphorical or otherwise, and we're going to have to give an account of ourselves. And if we don't get it right then, everything's going to fall apart. But if we get it right then everything will come together. And this thing is getting closer and closer, but we don't quite know what it is we're going to do when we get up on stage. We're not ready. We haven't prepared, and it's getting closer and closer. So you start to panic, and you think, "Oh, I better start figuring out what my lines should be." And just as you start to worry, start to concentrate on this, somebody taps you on the shoulder again and says, "Could you please do this?" And you kind of forget about it and you start doing this. I kind of felt this is how at least some of us are obliged to go through life.
There are some wonderful passages in the book. I love the ones where he's trying to practice the piano and how impossible that is because everyone has different demands on him. We have a passage selected from the book for you to read. I can take this little blue piece of paper out for you. Why don't you set the scene for us?
Well, here he's talking to somebody who probably is his little boy. I mean, everything's a little weird here. So a boy who was just a stranger's kid starts to respond to him as though he's his father, and after a while he kind of thinks, "Oh, well, I must be his father." He starts to behave like it is. All right, so to all intents and purposes, you know, he's talking to his little son here, and he's trying to explain why life has ended up rather messy between them. Boris, I know you must be wondering, I mean, why it is we can't just settle down and live quietly, the three of us. You must, I know you do, you must wonder why I have to go away all the time, even though your mother gets upset about it. Well, you have to understand, the reason I keep going on these trips is not because I don't love you and dearly want to be with you. In some ways, I'd like nothing better than to stay at home with you and Mother, live in an apartment like that one over there, anywhere. But you see, it's not so simple. I have to keep on going on these trips because, you see, you can never tell when it's going to come along. I mean the very special one, the very important trip. The one that's very, very important, not just for me, but for everyone in the whole world. How can I explain it to you, Boris? You're so young. You see, it would be so easy just to miss it. To say one time, no, I won't go, I'll just rest. Then only later I'll discover that was the one, the very, very important one. And you see, once you miss it, there's no going back. It would be too late. It won't matter how hard I travel afterwards. It won't matter, it would be too late. And all these years I've spent would have been for nothing. I've seen it happen to other people, Boris. They spend year after year traveling and they start to get tired, perhaps a little lazy. But that's often just when it comes along. And they miss it. And you know, they regret it for the rest of their lives. They get bitter and sad. By the time they die, they've become broken people. So you see, Boris, that's why I've got to carry on for the moment, keep traveling all the time. It makes things very difficult for us, I realize, but we have to be strong and patient, all three of us. It won't be much longer, I'm sure. It'll come soon, the very important one. Then it will all be done and I'll be able to relax and rest then. I could stay at home and all I wanted, it wouldn't matter. We could enjoy ourselves, just the three of us. We could do all the things we haven't been able to do. It won't be long now, I'm sure of it, but we'll just have to be patient. Boris, I hope you can understand what I'm saying. That's just him talking, trying to explain the strange feeling he has that this performance is coming at some point.
There is a romantic idea of the writer, I guess, where we think they've got the room of one's own and the stack of paper and just sit and wait for Eureka to strike and the writing begins. How much planning do you do to create a work like this before you actually do the writing?
Well, I'm probably not that typical in this. I know that there are a lot of writers who like to just put a blank sheet of paper into a word processor or whatever it is they use and just start, you know, and then all kinds of strange things tumble out, and sometimes they're shocked, sometimes they're not, and they use that as their kind of raw material, and they work with that and they shape it until it's finished. And I think that's probably a very good way to operate. It may be that I'm a control freak or something, but I find I can't do that unless I can't start writing the actual prose that goes into the book until I know quite a lot about the book. And I spend a lot of time actually making notes and notes and notes. I fill whole folders with notes about characters, about this particular movement and this, what's going to happen. So yes, I do leave some things to improvisation and chance. And if I start to go a certain direction, deviating away from the map I've made for myself, I'll sometimes follow it. But I find I can't do very much until I know quite a lot about where I'm going to go, particularly thematically. I need to know where I want to go.
That's like the architecture of the book, and then the way the architecture is fulfilled comes second.
Yeah, I need to have the shape of the book there before I start to actually write the words, fit it in. I think there are strengths and weaknesses of these different approaches. I think the approach of starting more or less starting right from the beginning with a blank sheet of paper, I mean, that allows you perhaps to go into areas that pleasantly surprise you. Perhaps because you surprise yourself and allow certain things you're too inhibited to normally produce to come out. And so I think a writer can go into very interesting territories by using that less guarded method.
Sounds though like it'd feel to you like jumping off a building without a parachute.
Well, it might to me. I mean, some people don't mind doing this, but it's not quite without a parachute, that method, because, you know, as a writer, you can always go back and draft and draft and draft. It's, I mean, it's not as exposed as, say, a
interviewing.
musician. Or what?
Interviewing.
Oh, interviewing, yeah, that's a much more exposed thing to do.
There was a passage in this book, I referred to it earlier, where he's trying to get to a piano and practice. And it did remind me of something Alex Haley had said on this program, where after the enormous success of Roots, he was never able to write again, really. He was badgered incessantly to do different things. In part of that scene, a man named Hoffman, the hotel manager, is driving Ryder around, and he says, "I had certain plans, such as you do when you are young, when you don't realize how limited time is, when you don't realize there's a shell built around you, a hard shell, so you can't get out." And there was a resonance with something, and the words were so particular that you said, and we were quoted in The Guardian last summer, and it echoed this. And you said, "I've only recently become aware that there's this other life I might have had, a whole other person I was supposed to become." And it seemed all wrapped up in this book. What did you mean by that?
I was probably referring to, I think I must have been responding to one of the many questions I often get about my Japanese background. And I think what I was saying was that I think many of us, perhaps, you know, have this idea that yes, if something way back in your life had gone just slightly differently, you might have turned into a very different person, and you'll be leading a very different kind of life. I mean, it's a kind of a dinner party game you can
Sort of
always play
fate.
with yourself.
The fickle hand of fate.
Yes. You know, just imagine if you'd never met that, or if your parents decided to do that. But I think for me, it's accentuated. That sense that you could have become somebody very different is very much accentuated by the fact that the family decided to leave Japan and then decided to stay away from Japan. So it tends to kind of underline this idea that yes, your life could go in any number of ways because of circumstances that are rather vague and out of your control. I'm very aware that if I had grown up in Japan, I would be a very different person in a very literal sense. I would speak a different language. I would have been influenced by a totally different set of values, and I very much doubt whether I would have been any kind of writer or anything like that. And so, it's a kind of a rather poignant thing as well. That in there might even be an aspect of me unconsciously and illogically that thinks I should have become this other person. That was the correct person to be. There were people like my grandparents who knew me when I was a child, who perhaps loved me because they assumed that I would become this other person, this Japanese person. And you can kind of see that now. Say in the United States, if somebody comes across a little boy and they're affectionate to that little boy, I mean, maybe some of that affection is acts on the premise that he's going to grow up into an American kid, and so I think this idea that maybe I let somebody down by turning into this other person, into this very westernized person, is maybe somewhere deep in me.
The way you grew up when you got to England, I think one of the words you used about your childhood, you were kind of an oddity, the only Japanese kid in this little proper English town, and you were living in two worlds linguistically, speaking Japanese at home, speaking English outside of your home. What kind of effect did that have on the way that you deal with and work with language as a writer?
I don't know what that does to me linguistically. I think more the effect of all that was that it put me. It's more to do with values rather than the linguistic side. You see, not only was I living with two languages when I was a child, I was living with two distinct sets of values. Inside the home, I was being brought up by Japanese parents who saw no reason to particularly adapt to English values because our return to Japan was imminent, and we were always about to go back the following year. And I was being brought up to live in Japan. And so it wasn't like the situation of an immigrant family that says, well, we're here now, to what extent are we going to become like the host culture. We were just visitors. So I was always encouraged to look at the values of my school friends and so on with respect, but almost like they were just the customs that the natives in this country had.
Arm's length.
Yeah, they were not. I was never told that this and this was the correct way to behave. You know, although I saw that all my school friends had certain rules and certain things that they were told were correct. I mean, I had a different set of values in the home, and this was particularly pronounced because I think the Japanese way of child rearing is so different to particularly what was then the English way.
Different set of values and almost a different sense of time. You were sort of a holding pattern in your house, but the rest of the world outside your house operated on a different sense of time. You were there. You were part of it.
Yeah, I guess so. I guess that's right. So I might have grown up with this. I think that has more effect, I think, on my writing. I haven't quite worked it out, but I mean, looking back, I think it's not so much a linguistic thing, but this dual value thing.
Are you at work on the next book already, talking about the unconsoled, working on the next one?
I suppose I am, yes. I mean, you shouldn't waste time. We've been talking about time running out.
And time is running out. One of the things that I've read in more recent conversations with you is it's sort of a pressing feeling you seem to have to write something relevant that's international, that deals with the concerns of our time. Is that sort of the thing that's coming your way in the next book? Social relevance, in a sense.
I'm not that bothered myself with. I don't think consciously that I have to address obviously international themes. I don't. See, for me, an international theme is just something that's humanly universal.
But what do you mean by relevance, then?
By relevance, I mean it's just. I'd like to write the kind of books that people all around the world can relate to. It's as simple as that. I don't imagine for a moment that an international book is a book that is some kind of fiction version of Time or Newsweek. I don't think that you necessarily write an international novel by writing about international issues or about people who get on aeroplanes the whole time. You write an international book because it's about emotions and themes that human beings all around the world can relate to. And I think what that means is that at the technical level, you mustn't do things that are too provincial, too culturally bound, so that if I write a book that only people in London or in England could understand, then that's not going to be a great deal of help here in Seattle or in France or in Japan. And I think part of the effect of having to promote my book and come on shows like yours is that at some level, perhaps unconsciously, next time I sit down, I will remember that whatever I write, I may well have to come and explain it to you again here, or I have to explain it to somebody in Italy. And so I don't have to worry about it consciously. It's my sense of the reader has kind of become more international.
Well, you're welcome to come back anytime. It's been a pleasure talking with you.
It's been great being here. Thank you.
Kazuo Ishiguro. Thank you.
To see more UWTV classics, visit uwtv.org/classics.